London, 1888. The city was alive with wealth, power, and progress, but beneath the grand facades of Victorian mansions, another London existed, a city of shadows, of poverty, of desperation. And it was here, in the narrow streets of Whitechapel, that fear would take root. The East End was overcrowded and filthy. Families crammed into single rooms. Alcohol flowed as freely as misery. Crime was a way of life, and for many women, prostitution was not a choice, but survival. They walked the fog-choked alleys at night, hoping to earn just enough for food or a bed in a doss house. But in August of 1888, those same streets began to echo with a new kind of dread. A predator had emerged, a killer with no face, no name, and no mercy. His victims were women whose society had already discarded. Yet his crimes would shake London and the world for centuries. On August 31st, a woman named Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly, was found brutally murdered in Bucks Row. Her throat had been cut so deeply that her head was nearly severed. The sheer violence left even hardened police officers shaken. But this was only the beginning. Polly's death was first dismissed as another violent assault in a dangerous district. Whitechapel was no stranger to crime. Yet something about this killing was different, something colder, more deliberate. The newspapers seized upon the murder, sensationalizing every detail. The East End was painted as a place of horror, filth, and blood, and in doing so, they gave the killer exactly what he wanted, an audience. Just days later, another woman, Annie Chapman, would meet the same fate. And suddenly, whispers spread. This was no ordinary murderer. This was someone who stalked the shadows with a purpose. London was about to meet the monster history would remember as Jack the Ripper. But who was Jack the Ripper? Was he a madman driven by rage? A surgeon with unholy skill? Or someone far more ordinary, hiding in plain sight? The hunt was only just beginning. The death of Annie Chapman on September 8, 1888, marked a turning point. London was no longer whispering. Now it was screaming. Annie was found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Her body was mutilated in ways too horrifying for the public to hear. The killer wasn't just murdering. He was dissecting, cutting with precision, removing organs. This was no random act of violence. It was ritual, almost surgical. The police were overwhelmed. Detectives of Scotland Yard patrolled the alleys, questioning locals. But the killer seemed always one step ahead. Witnesses contradicted one another. Clues led nowhere. And the press mocked the police for their incompetence. It was during this chaos that the name Jack the Ripper first appeared. A letter, signed by the Ripper himself, was sent to the Central News Agency. It mocked the police. It promised more blood. And it ended with a chilling phrase, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." Whether the letter was real or a hoax hardly mattered. The name stuck. The legend was born. By late September, fear had taken complete hold of Whitechapel. Women refused to walk the streets at night. Vigilantes roamed, hoping to catch a glimpse of the killer. The newspapers printed lurid details daily, fueling both terror and fascination. Then came September 30th, a night known as a double event. That night, the Ripper struck twice, 2 murders within an hour. Elizabeth Stride was found first, her throat cut, but her body showed no mutilations. Many believe the killer was interrupted, forced to flee before he could complete his ritual. But only 45 minutes later, another woman, Catherine Eddowes, was found. This time, the mutilations returned, horrific and deliberate. The killer was making a statement. By now, London was gripped in hysteria. Police were no closer to catching him. The killer moved like smoke, vanishing after each murder. And the streets of Whitechapel grew colder with every passing night. But the Ripper wasn't finished. His most infamous victim, Mary Jane Kelly, still waited in the shadows, and her murder would horrify the world in ways London had never seen before. The murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes had already thrown London into chaos. The city now lived in fear, but the Ripper wasn't done. October passed without another killing, and some began to wonder if the murderer had fled, being imprisoned for another crime, or simply vanished back into the darkness. But November would prove them wrong. On November 9th, 1888, the killer struck with a fury that eclipsed everything that came before. His victim was Mary Jane Kelly, the youngest of the Ripper's canonical 5 victims. She was only 25 years old, living in a small single-room lodging at 13 Miller's Court. Unlike the previous victims, Mary Jane was murdered indoors, giving the killer more time and privacy to unleash his brutality. When her landlord's assistant peered through her window the next morning, what he saw was not a human body but a slaughterhouse. Mary Jane Kelly was mutilated beyond recognition. Her face had been destroyed, her body cut open, organs placed around the room. It was a scene so horrifying that police officers, men used to blood and violence, were left shaken to the core. This wasn't just murder. It was desecration, a statement, a message written in blood across the walls of Whitechapel. And with Mary Jane Kelly's death, something else happened. The killing stopped. Just as suddenly as the Ripper had appeared, he was gone. No one knew why. Did he die? Did he flee the city? Or had he simply chosen to end his reign of terror, satisfied with the nightmare he left behind? But the mystery of the Ripper did not die with Mary Jane Kelly. It had only begun. For even as the blood dried in Miller's Court, questions grew louder. Who was Jack the Ripper, and why did he kill? Theories swirled, suspects multiplied, and London found itself caught in a web of obsession that continues to this day. While the killings terrified the public, another part of the Ripper legend emerged from the written word. The letters. During the Autumn of Terror, police and newspapers were flooded with correspondence. Hundreds of letters arrived, each claiming to be from the killer himself. Some were crude jokes, others were taunts. Most were dismissed as hoaxes, but a few stood out. The most infamous was a Dear Boss letter where the name Jack the Ripper first appeared. Written in red ink, it mocked the police, promised more killings, and ended with that chilling sign-off, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." Then came the Saucy Jackie postcard, arriving just after the double event. It gloated about the 2 murders in a single night. Many believed it was proof the killer himself had written it, as the timing was too perfect. And then there was a From Hell letter, sent with half of a preserved human kidney. It read like something torn from a nightmare. The crude handwriting spoke of frying and eating the organ. If genuine, it was the closest the world ever came to hearing the Ripper's true voice. But were these letters real, or were they the work of cruel pranksters feeding the flames of fear? To this day, experts disagree. What is certain, however, is that they cemented the Ripper's myth. He wasn't just a murderer anymore. He was a specter, a ghost writing from the shadows, taunting an entire city. But if the Ripper's letters were not enough, his list of suspects was longer still. From doctors to butchers, from lunatics to lords, the hunt for Jack turned into a hunt for shadows. And each suspect brought the case closer, and yet never close enough to the truth. With no arrests, no confessions, and no clear evidence, the police turned to suspicion. Dozens of names emerged, some more likely than others, some now legendary. One of the first suspects was Montague John Drute, a barrister and schoolteacher. He was found dead in the Thames in December 1888, just weeks after Mary Jane Kelly's murder. Some believe he had taken his own life because he was the Ripper, but there was little real evidence, only timing and speculation. Then there was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-Jewish immigrant living in Whitechapel. He was mentally unstable, often violent, and later confined to an asylum. Police officials of the time even named him as a prime suspect in private notes. Modern forensic testing of DNA on a shawl allegedly linked to Catherine Edo suggested Kosminski could have been the killer. Yet critics argue the evidence is weak, the DNA contaminated, the conclusion uncertain. Another was Michael Ostrog, a Russian doctor and thief. He was suspected simply because of his criminal past. In the end, no solid link was ever proven. And then George Chapman, real name Severin Klosowski, a barber and later convicted poisoner. Chapman had lived in Whitechapel at the time of the murders. His cold, methodical killings of wives through poisoning suggested a dark heart. But the leap from poisoner to mutilating serial killer was difficult to prove. The suspects were many, the evidence thin. For every theory, another emerged. Some accused men of medicine. Others whispered about the royal family. And still others believed the Ripper was a ghost of poverty itself, a faceless figure born from the misery of Whitechapel. But if suspects filled the police files, one suspect stood above them all, a man whose name would echo across centuries, wrapped in conspiracy, secrecy, and scandal, the royal surgeon, Sir William Gull. No case in criminal history has spawned more conspiracy theories than Jack the Ripper. And among them, one has refused to die, the royal conspiracy. It begins with Prince Albert Victor, grandson of Queen Victoria. Some whisper that the young prince had a secret relationship with a Catholic shopgirl, Mary Kelly, the same Mary Jane Kelly who became the Ripper's final victim. Others claim she bore his illegitimate child. In this theory, the murders were not random, but deliberate. A cover-up, witnesses silenced, women who knew too much carved from history with a surgeon's blade. And the hand behind it all? Sir William Gull, the Queen's physician, said to be acting on royal orders. The theory was popularized by books and later films like From Hell. It painted the Ripper not as a lone madman, but as an assassin working to protect the monarchy. But historians largely dismiss it. Prince Albert Victor was far from Whitechapel during most of the murders. Sir William Gull was in declining health, and the theory relies more on whispers than facts. Still, the power of the royal conspiracy lies not in its truth, but in its allure. It makes the Ripper story not just about murder, but about power, secrets, and the machinery of empire. To understand Jack the Ripper, one must understand Whitechapel. The East End was a world apart from the grandeur of Westminster and Kensington. Here, life was cheap, death was constant, and survival was a daily gamble. Overcrowding meant entire families lived in one room. Disease spread rapidly. Alcohol was escape, and for many women, so was prostitution. These women were not nameless or faceless. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, forced into the streets by poverty. And yet, society judged them harshly. Newspapers called them fallen women. Police treated them with disdain. Their murders were often shrugged off, until the Ripper forced London to look. In this way, the Ripper was both predator and mirror. His killings exposed the hypocrisy of Victorian society, a world that prided itself on morality while ignoring the suffering in its own streets. The women he killed, Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly, were not just victims. They were the forgotten, the discarded, the invisible, and it was their blood that made London finally pay attention. But attention soon turned to anger. As the murders continued, fury erupted, not only at the killer, but at the police, the press, and the system itself. The Ripper had not only claimed lives, he had sparked a social reckoning. The Ripper murders did not just reveal the horror of one man, they revealed the failings of an entire system. The Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police both investigated the crimes, often clashing with one another. Rivalries, poor communication, and outdated methods crippled the investigation. There were no fingerprints, no forensic science, no criminal profiling. Detectives relied on eyewitnesses, many of whom were unreliable or contradictory. Clues slipped away. Evidence was destroyed. One of the most infamous examples was a Goulston Street graffito. After Catherine Eddowes' murder, a blood-stained piece of her apron was found near a chalked message on a wall. The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. Some saw it as a clue, others as a red herring. But before photographs could be taken, the writing was ordered erased, erasing perhaps the Ripper's only direct message. Meanwhile, the press hounded police, mocking their failures, fueling public panic. Vigilantes roamed the streets. The people of Whitechapel felt abandoned, unprotected, betrayed. The police never caught Jack the Ripper. They never even came close. And in their failure, the legend of the Ripper grew stronger. But though the investigation failed, the story did not end in 1888. Jack the Ripper lived on, in books, in films, in endless theories, a shadow that refuses to fade. And in Part 9, we will explore how the Ripper became not just a killer, but an icon of fear that shaped crime history forever. When the blood dried in Whitechapel, Jack the Ripper should have faded into history like so many killers before him. But he didn't. Instead, he grew. The murders of 1888 were not just crimes. They became stories. Newspapers, desperate for sales, turned the killer into a myth. Headlines screamed his name. Illustrations showed a shadowy figure in a top hat and cloak. He was everywhere and nowhere at once. And then came the books. Reporters, detectives, even armchair theorists published their accounts. Some claimed to know the truth. Others exaggerated for profit. Jack the Ripper became less of a man and more of a ghost, an empty figure anyone could fill with their own fears. The Ripper entered literature, film, and eventually television. He became the template for the modern serial killer, the first celebrity murderer. Long before names like Bundy, Dahmer, or Zodiac, there was Jack. But why did he endure when so many others were forgotten? The answer lies in mystery. The fact that he was never caught, never unmasked, left an open wound. A question without an answer. Human imagination rushed to fill the void. Was he a surgeon? A lunatic? A prince? A demon? Each theory kept the story alive. And as the years passed, the Ripper evolved. In some tales, he was a monster. In others, a symbol of corruption. He was whatever society needed him to be, a warning, a fascination, a nightmare that refused to die. But while myth kept him alive, the victims were often forgotten. The women whose lives were stolen became footnotes to his fame. And in Part 10, we return to them, to the human cost of Jack the Ripper, and the reason his shadow still haunts us today. Jack the Ripper killed at least 5 women. Their names deserve to be remembered: Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. They were not rich. They were not powerful. They were women of the margins, struggling to survive in a world that judged them harshly and cared for them little. For over a century, their names were overshadowed by the man who murdered them. But today, historians and advocates work to restore their stories, to remind the world that they were more than victims. They were human. And yet, the fascination with the Ripper endures. Books, tours, films, endless theories. He has become a symbol of mystery itself. But the truth may be simpler, darker, and more tragic. Jack the Ripper was not a ghost or a prince, not a monster from the shadows. He was a man who exploited poverty, darkness, and indifference to commit atrocities, a man who hid in plain sight and got away with it. The police failed. Society failed. And in that failure, the Ripper slipped into legend. Today, walking the streets of Whitechapel, the world is very different. The alleys are lit. The doss houses are gone. But if you listen closely, the air still carries whispers of 1888. Whispers of footsteps in the fog. Whispers of a knife glinting in the dark. Whispers of a figure who vanishes before you can turn your head. Jack the Ripper is not just a story of a killer. It is a story of fear, of neglect, of society's willingness to forget the vulnerable. And until the day we learn who he was, or accept that we never will, the shadow of Jack the Ripper will always remain. And so, the case is closed, yet forever unsolved. Jack the Ripper has no grave, no face, no name, only a shadow cast across history. A reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who walk unseen among us.